Hi guys, it's Troy at The Full Setup, back with another benchmark review. Now for my last benchmark we tested the Ryzen 2600 and GTX 1660 Ti's outstanding 1080p performance. But for today's video it's time to test Intel's direct competing CPU, the i5-8400. So I will be benchmarking a GTX 1660 Ti and i5-8400 at 1080p low to ultra settings. I will be testing 11 games for you today with a mix of stock and overclock results for you. Over the next few weeks, I will also be benchmarking 1440p and ultra-wide performance. So if you want to see those videos, make sure you hit that subscribe button. And as a huge thank you to you all, I'm also running a competition for a free Deepcool L240 liquid cooler, and you can find out how to enter that at the end of the video. As for the GTX 1660 Ti, I'm using a PMY gaming OC with 6GB of GDDR6. This GTX 1660 Ti has a maximum boost rating of 1815 MHz, but as you can see on screen, out of the box boosts are much higher if you keep the graphics card nice and cool. Now there is a full spec list of the PC I'm using in the description of this video, but just a brief overview of the test system. I'm using an i5-8400 set to its 3.8 GHz all-core turbo. I'm pairing it with 16GB of 2666 MHz DDR4, and I'm running it on an ASRock B360M Pro 4 motherboard. Before we start with the review, I would like to thank today's sponsor GVG Mall. Now I'm sure you're like myself and you have spent many an hour planning your dream PC builds, only to be left crying when you have to add your Windows operating system at over £100, which normally results in a CPU or GPU downgrade. Well, not anymore. GVG Mall offers some of the best pricing on Windows 10 Pro license keys, and they have kindly given me a 20% discount code to share with you. The reason they're able to offer Windows so cheap is that they do not provide you with any physical media and only provide you with a license key. But don't worry, you can download the installer from Microsoft's website, then simply install Windows on a USB stick and you are good to go. As well as Windows and Office, GVG Mall also offers some great prices on games too, and there is a link to their website in the description. Let's start with stock versus overclock performance then. Now seeming as we only benchmarked the 2600 last week, I'm going to include some of those scores in the video for you today, so you've got a nice i5-8400 versus Ryzen 2600 comparison for you as well. Now as I already mentioned, this card is boosting rather high, and I always like to set an overclock that all of you can achieve. I don't want to do some crazy overclock that's just going to crash your PC. I want you to be able to run something like I am running in the video. So I was only able to add 110 MHz to the core, but I would highly suggest that you start at 75 MHz and work your way up. Now as for memory, if you look at the RTX cards that also pack GDDR6, they're running at 14 gigabits per second versus this card that's running at 12 gigabits per second. So there should be huge headroom for overclocking the memory, and there is. I've had no problem overclocking the memory to 1500 MHz, but one thing that I was finding is that I wasn't actually getting any more performance over 1000 MHz. So I thought, why put the GPU under more stress than it actually needs to be put under? Now I'm not saying you won't get more gains, I'm just saying I didn't. So you can give it a go, but I would recommend just setting it to 1000 MHz for the memory. Shadow of the Tomb Raider. So we are running this at ultra settings with TAA enabled. Now for the i5-8400 at 3.8 GHz and the GPU stock, we have a minimum of 68 and an average of 91 frames per second. For the Ryzen 2600, also at stock settings with a stock GPU, we have a minimum of 62 and an average of 81 frames per second. Overclocking the graphics card with the i5-8400 gives us a minimum of 71 and an average of 96 frames per second. Running the Ryzen 2600 at 4.2 GHz and also overclocking the graphics card gives us a minimum of 65 and an average of 88 frames per second. Moving on to Far Cry New Dawn, also at ultra settings with TAA enabled. Now for the i5-8400 and 1660 Ti, all at stock settings, we have a minimum of 67 and an average of 88 frames per second. As for the Ryzen 2600 at all stock, we have a minimum of 64 and an average of 83 frames per second. Pairing the i5-8400 with an overclocked 1660 Ti gives us a minimum of 67 and an average of 91 frames per second. Running the Ryzen 2600 at 4.2 GHz and also having the GPU overclock gives a minimum of 79 and an average of 97 frames per second. And finally Shadow of War, and you've guessed it, at ultra settings with TAA enabled. So for all stock with the i5-8400, we have a minimum of 48 and an average of 82 frames per second. For the Ryzen 2600 at all stock settings, we have a minimum of 48 and an average of 81 frames per second. Overclocking the GPU with the i5-8400 gives a minimum of 52 and an average of 88 frames per second. And finally, running the Ryzen 2600 and GPU both overclocked gives a minimum of 52 and an average of 87 frames per second. So there was the stock versus overclock performance for you. Now for the rest of this video, we're just going to focus on gameplay footage, but I am going to leave the GPU overclock. And as I state in all of my videos, the reason is as we know, we're gaining about 5 frames per second from overclocking, but we're also losing 5 frames per second from recording the footage using the video shadow play. So it sort of levels itself out, and what you're actually seeing here on screen is actually much closer to stock performance than it ever will be overclocked. And as you can see, the system has no issues running Forza Horizon 4 at ultra settings. Frame rates are always above 100, mostly around 120 frames per second, so you're going to have no issues running this title at all. Moving on to PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Now we're going to start off playing PUBG as I always play it. So this is at my settings. These are sort of competitive settings. So we've got everything set to low. Everything is at low 1080p settings. But I have the view distance set to ultra so I can see everything that's around me. And as you can see, it has no issues maxing out my 144Hz panel. Now you're going to see a little bit of bottlenecking here, but again, the frame rate is that high, it really doesn't matter. But if you are a texture junkie, cranking it up to ultra settings and you're still going to be playing this game at 100 frames per second. So PUBG performance is absolutely perfect on this system. Now, I did have a few complaints in my last video that I'm not playing in demanding areas on Metro Exodus, and I do apologise I haven't been able to play through to the desert location yet. But I think we can all agree that this is a game that really varies in frame rate depending on what you are actually doing. Now, I'm running this at ultra settings and I do have tessellation on, but I do have Hairworks turned off, so I don't know if that's why I'm getting some extra FPS, because I've got Hairworks off. Now, there will be bits of the game that are running at over 100 frames per second, but I do find for the most, I'm just running it between 80 and 100 frames per second at ultra settings with the 1660 Ti. And even without ray tracing and all those magic bells and whistles from DLSS, I must say this game does look absolutely fantastic, and I do think you will thoroughly enjoy it on this combo. Moving on to Apex Legends then. Well, I've actually finally been able to play a few more rounds. I'm still a noob, I'm not going to lie, I'm still pretty noobish at this game, but you know, I'm starting to get some kills together, and I want to say a huge thanks to everyone in the last video who sent me links or just instructions on how I could remove that frame cap. The 144Hz frame cap is off now, and as you can see at low settings, this system is absolutely flying. The game feels ultra smooth, really enjoying playing this game, and it still looks really good at low settings as well. Now, cranking it up to ultra, again, this is a game where the frame rate can really vary. So I'll find areas where I'm sort of like 100 to 120 frames per second. You know, everything feels real nice, really responsive on my 144Hz panel. But I do find for the most, you're going to be gaming between 80 and 100 frames per second. Now, if you didn't want to play at all low settings like I normally do, I would probably just drop a few settings to medium, and then you're probably going to be at a solid 120 throughout playing this game. And finally, one of the most demanding games that we're going to be testing today, Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, as I always say in pretty much all my videos with this, I just don't really like playing this game at ultra high settings, even though the card can handle it. I just find that I do get some real nasty frame dips when I'm playing at ultra. It's just at a level that I don't want to play at. Now, you might be happy having dips down to 45 or 30 frames per second. I'm just saying that's not for me. But to be fair, at very high settings, you probably should turn a couple of settings up, because you can see over here in the top left-hand corner, there is some bottlenecks with this system. The i5-8400 is struggling a little bit with this game, but as we know, Assassin's Creed titles have always been super CPU demanding. So there were the benchmark results, and just like when I paired the 1660 Ti with the Ryzen 2600, it's also an absolutely fantastic performing 1080p graphics card with an i5-8400. Now, in my previous video, I spoke a lot about that there was a lot of competing graphics cards within the price range of the 1660 Ti, so sort of that 200 to 300, just over £300 price range. And I thought between £200 and £300 that this should be the card that you would go and buy. This would be the card, well, that I would buy anyway. But I really do still think it needs to be a little bit cheaper. I would love to see models available for about £225, because even this single fan model that I've got is running incredibly quiet, even with the fans maxed out at 2000 RPM. It's a really quiet graphics card, and it's not running that hot either. But yeah, if you're looking at spending almost like £280 to £300 on a 1660 Ti, you'd be an absolutely idiot not to spend an extra £30 to £40 and buy an RTX 2060. So that's sort of what I said about in my last video. So for this bit of the video, I want to talk a little bit more about what should you pick out of the Ryzen 2600 or the i5-8400. And I need to say this in a way not to probably more piss off AMD fanboys than Intel ones. So at ultra settings, both of them perform close to each other. There's a couple of games the 2600 performs better at, especially when it's overclocked. But really the i5-8400 is slightly ahead, but it's not that noticeable. We're talking like 1 to 3 FPS. There isn't really anything in it at ultra settings. But if you're someone like me that likes to play at lower settings, who is into first-person shooters and stuff like that, Intel is still king. Now, even though there were bottlenecks with both, the i5-8400 is slightly ahead. And I know the 8400 is a little bit more expensive, but there's some things you need to take into account here. For Intel, you know, especially if you're new to building PCs, you literally plug it into the socket. The 8400 is fine on any 3000 series motherboard. It doesn't, you know, it's not going to throttle like some of the higher end ones. You just plug that CPU in, you plug in some 2666 megahertz memory, and it's good to go straight away. AMD is a lot different. You have to tinker more to get the most out of it. So even though I've got almost as close to performance as my i5-8400 when I'm playing shooters at lower settings, think about what I've had to do to get it there. I've had to overclock it to 4.2 gigahertz. So then you're going to have to buy a new cooler. So you need to account for the cooler. That's going to be at least 30 or 40 pounds. You might want to spend a bit more on liquid. So that's going to be 60 to 100 pounds. You then need the memory. You need very fast memory, not just speed. I'm not just talking about 3200 megahertz. You need memory with very good latencies on it and memory that you can tweak, preferably Samsung B-Die. And that memory comes at a premium again. So that's more money put on top of it. And then you need a motherboard that can run that memory like that. And there's not really a guarantee knowing that your board is going to run such tight timing. So yeah, for me, if it's just for gamers, I'd probably say, yeah, go with Intel. I would still take Intel, but that's what I would take. If you were going to ask me what I would tell you to take, I would actually probably still tell you to go down the AMD route because, you know, you get a bit more with the motherboards. You get nicer motherboards at a cheaper price. You can do overclocking if that's something you want to get into. You know, you don't have to buy the cooler on day one and overclock it straight away. You can buy the cooler a little bit later. And also, we've got the Ryzen 3000 coming out now. I know there's been some leaks over the last few days. I just see them as leaks. I'm not really interested in the leaks until I hear them from AMD. But I think we know Ryzen 3000 is going to be a lot faster. It's going to perform a lot better in games and will probably be catching up with Intel. I don't think it's going to overtake it, but I think they'll be a lot more on par at higher refresh rate gaming. So yeah, I'm just waffling on now. And I'm trying to say this in a way not to antagonize all the fanboys like I said earlier. But yeah, for me, if I was going to go out and buy it, I believe in just buying the best system you can right now, and that is Intel still. But from the price to performance standpoint, I understand why most of you would pick AMD. So how do you enter the competition? And it's really simple. You've got two things to do. Firstly, you need to subscribe to the channel and hit my notification bell so you're going to get notifications to all my great content that's coming over the next few months. Then you need to get over to my Discord server. Now there's a link to my Discord in the description for this video. As you can see here, there is a server where you can enter the competition. All you have to do is leave a comment. Please, I don't want a massive discussion on there. Just a comment saying enter is more than enough, and that will get you in the competition. And the competition ends on the 17th of March. Anyway, that's it from me today. If you like the video, leave a like. If you dislike the video, please tell me why. Make sure you subscribe and make sure you enter that competition.